Melissa Carter thought she had found love with Derek Simmons. But that love would cost her everything, including the life of her 4-year-old daughter, Ava. What started as a toxic romance quickly spiraled into unthinkable cruelty, leading to a crime so horrific that even seasoned investigators were left shaken. By the time the truth came to light, it was already too late. Ava had suffered the unthinkable, and Melissa's betrayal would haunt her forever. Melissa Carter had always imagined a better life for herself and her daughter, Ava. At 27, she was a single mother, trying to escape the ghosts of her past. Her previous relationship had been filled with violence and neglect, leaving her emotionally drained and desperate for change. Ava, a bright-eyed 4-year-old, was the only source of light in her life, but that light began to dim when Melissa met Derek Simmons. Derek was 19, younger and reckless, with a troubled past that most people avoided. He had been in and out of juvenile detention centers for theft and assault, but to Melissa, he was different. He gave her attention, whispered sweet words she hadn't heard in years, and made her feel wanted. It didn't take long for her to fall for him, ignoring the warning signs that should have sent her running. At first, their relationship seemed passionate, even intoxicating. Derek moved into her small apartment after only a few weeks, claiming he had nowhere else to go. Melissa didn't hesitate to let him in. She was blinded by love, craving the affection she had been missing for so long. But with Derek's arrival, things in the apartment began to change. The once warm and welcoming home started to feel suffocating, heavy with an unseen darkness. Ava, who had always been a joyful child, sensed it immediately. She no longer ran to her mother with open arms when she came home. Instead, she clung to her stuffed bunny, watching Derek with fearful eyes. He never hit her, at least not at first, but his presence alone was enough to make her shrink away. He treated her like an inconvenience, barely acknowledging her existence unless it was to scold her for something trivial. Melissa didn't notice the shift, or maybe she chose not to. She was too busy trying to keep Derek happy, desperate to prove she was worth loving. When he criticized Ava's behavior, she found herself agreeing. "She's spoiled," he would say. "You let her get away with too much." Slowly, Melissa's patience with her daughter wore thin. She started snapping at her over small things, punishing her more harshly than before. Neighbors began to notice the change. The sound of Ava's laughter, once a daily melody in the apartment complex, faded away. Instead, muffled cries were sometimes heard through the thin walls, followed by Melissa's sharp voice and Derek's deeper, more menacing tone. One night, a piercing scream rang out, cutting through the silence of the building. A woman in the next apartment paused, debating whether to call the police. But after a few moments, the screaming stopped, and she convinced herself it was just a tantrum. No one knew what was really happening behind those walls. No one saw the way Ava flinched when Derek walked past her. No one heard the cruel words whispered in the dark, planting seeds of fear in a child too young to understand why her mother no longer protected her. And no one could predict the nightmare that was yet to come. Derek's presence in the apartment became suffocating, his influence over Melissa growing stronger by the day. He had a way of twisting her thoughts, convincing her that Ava was a problem, rather than a child in need of love. Melissa, already fragile and desperate to hold on to Derek, started believing him. She told herself that Derek only wanted to help her be a better mother, that his harsh words were just tough love. But what she failed to see was how deeply his poison had seeped into her mind. Ava, once a bright and curious little girl, was no longer allowed to be a child. Every movement, every word she spoke, seemed to irritate Derek. If she dropped her cup at dinner, he called her clumsy. If she cried when she was hungry, he said she was being dramatic. If she reached for Melissa's hand, he pulled her away, telling Melissa that Ava needed to learn independence. Melissa never objected. She wanted to keep Derek happy, and if that meant changing the way she treated her daughter, she was willing to do it. Punishments became a regular part of Ava's life. At first they were small, being sent to bed without dinner, forced to sit in the dark closet when she cried. But as the days passed, they escalated. Derek started locking her in the bathroom for hours, ignoring her screams as she banged on the door. Melissa stood outside, listening but doing nothing, convincing herself that Ava deserved it. "She needs discipline," Derek would say. "She needs to toughen up." And Melissa, desperate for his approval, nodded in agreement. Ava's small body began to show signs of neglect. She was losing weight, her cheeks no longer round and full, but hollowed by hunger. Her skin, once soft and warm, was now covered in bruises and scratches. At daycare, her teachers noticed. They asked her what had happened, but she only shook her head. When they pressed further, she lowered her gaze and whispered, "I was bad." The teachers reported their concerns to social services, but nothing came of it. A caseworker visited the apartment once, but Melissa put on a convincing act, claiming Ava was just clumsy. With no clear evidence of abuse, the case was closed. Derek took this as a sign that they were untouchable. His cruelty toward Ava grew worse, his punishments more sadistic. One night, after she spilled a glass of milk, he forced her to sit in the bathtub with ice-cold water for an hour. Melissa watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. Ava's tiny body shivered violently, her lips turning blue. But Derek only smirked. "She'll learn," he muttered. And Melissa, though a part of her still felt the weight of guilt, said nothing. The line between discipline and torture had blurred. Ava was no longer seen as a daughter, but as an inconvenience, a nuisance that stood in the way of Melissa's happiness. And soon, Derek would take things even further, pushing Melissa past the point of no return. Melissa stood in the dimly lit bathroom, her hands trembling as she turned the faucet. Steam rose from the water, curling into the air like ghostly fingers. Derek stood behind her, watching, his expression void of any emotion. Ava sat on the bathroom floor, her tiny body curled into itself, eyes wide with fear. She knew something bad was about to happen, but she didn't know how bad. Derek had convinced Melissa that Ava needed a cleansing. He claimed the child had become spoiled and disobedient, that she needed to be purified through pain. Melissa, too far gone to question him, nodded along. Somewhere deep inside her, a small voice screamed at her to stop, but she buried it beneath layers of desperation and fear. Derek was all she had left, and if he wanted this, she would do it. The water in the tub was near boiling, its surface rippling as Melissa hesitated. Derek grew impatient. With one swift motion, he grabbed Ava by the arm and yanked her toward the bathtub. She screamed, her tiny legs kicking as she struggled to break free. Melissa flinched at the sound, but she didn't intervene. Her love for Derek had overshadowed everything else, even the maternal instinct to protect her own child. Derek forced Ava into the scalding water, her piercing cries filling the apartment. She thrashed violently, her small hands clawing at the edge of the tub, desperate to escape the unbearable heat. Her skin turned an angry red within seconds, blistering upon contact with the boiling water. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, an acrid, sickening scent that made Melissa's stomach churn. But she still did nothing. Ava's screams grew, weaker, her body convulsing from the unbearable pain. Derek held her down, his grip like iron, preventing her from escaping. The child's struggles became less frantic as her body started to shut down, her voice turning into whimpers, then silence. Her small frame went limp, her head lolling to the side. Only then did Derek let go, watching as Ava's lifeless form floated in the water, her once soft skin peeling away in grotesque patches. Melissa stared at her daughter's body, a hollow emptiness settling in her chest. The reality of what she had done was undeniable. Ava was gone. There was no undoing it, no excuse that could erase the horror of what had just happened. For a brief moment, she considered pulling her daughter out, holding her in her arms, and begging for forgiveness. But Derek's voice cut through the silence. "We need to clean this up." His tone was cold, detached, as if he had just disposed of a piece of trash rather than taken the life of an innocent child. Melissa swallowed the lump in her throat, her hands shaking as she reached for a towel. She wrapped Ava's burned, motionless body in it, careful not to look at her face. Then, a sudden knock on the front door shattered the silence. Sarah stood outside the apartment, shifting uncomfortably as she knocked again. She had been hearing strange sounds from Melissa's unit for weeks, muffled cries, angry voices, sudden silences. But tonight had been different. The scream she heard was unlike anything before, raw and filled with agony. It had sent chills down her spine. And now she needed to know if everything was all right. Inside, Melissa froze, her breath hitching as she clutched the towel-wrapped bundle in her arms. Derek's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. He motioned for her to stay quiet, creeping toward the door. Sarah knocked again, louder this time. "Melissa, I heard something. Is everything okay?" Derek turned to Melissa, his voice low and sharp. "Say she's sleeping. Get rid of her." Melissa's hands trembled as she gently laid Ava's body on the bathroom floor. The sight of the child's lifeless, burned form made bile rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't fall apart now. With shaky steps, she moved toward the door and opened it just enough to show her face. Sarah's eyes scanned her, noticing the pale skin, the way Melissa's pupils were dilated. She looked like she had seen a ghost. "Hey," Sarah said hesitantly. "I heard screaming. It sounded bad." Melissa forced a weak smile. Ava had a nightmare. She's asleep now." Sarah frowned. Something wasn't right. She leaned in slightly, catching a whiff of something that made her stomach twist, a strange, burnt, metallic smell, faint but unmistakable. Her eyes flicked past Melissa's shoulder, and for a brief second, she thought she saw a wet footprint on the tile floor inside. Melissa noticed her hesitation and shifted uncomfortably. "It's really late. I should get back to bed." But Sarah wasn't convinced. The smell, the way Melissa's voice shook, the eerie silence behind her, it all felt wrong. "I think I should see Ava," Sarah said firmly, trying to push past the door. Melissa panicked. "No, I mean, she's really tired. She had a rough day." Before Sarah could argue, something clattered inside the apartment. A sharp, metallic clang, like someone knocking something over. Melissa stiffened. Sarah's heart pounded. "I'm calling the police," Sarah said suddenly, stepping back. Derek's voice roared from inside. "No, you're not!" The door slammed shut in Sarah's face. She didn't wait. She sprinted back to her apartment, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. "I think something really bad happened," she told the dispatcher. "I think a little girl is in danger." Inside, Derek was pacing, his mind racing. "We need to leave. Now." Melissa stood frozen, staring at Ava's body on the bathroom floor. For the first time, the weight of what she had done crashed over her like a tidal wave. Then, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Red and blue lights flashed outside the apartment complex, reflecting against the windows like a warning of what was to come. The sound of sirens grew deafening as police cars screeched to a halt, their doors swinging open. Officers moved quickly, surrounding the building, their hands resting on their holsters. Inside the apartment, Melissa stood paralyzed, her mind unable to process the rapid turn of events. Derek, however, was already moving, yanking open drawers, and shoving things into a backpack. He turned to Melissa, his voice low but sharp. "We need to go. Now." Melissa didn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on Ava's body, still wrapped in the damp towel on the bathroom floor. The skin that had once been soft and warm was now raw, blistered, peeling away in places where the water had scalded it. Her little hands, so often reaching for her mother's embrace, were now stiff, frozen in a final plea for help. A loud bang at the door made her flinch. "Police! Open up!" Derek's eyes darted around the apartment, searching for an escape. But it was too late. Heavy footsteps pounded against the wood as the officers forced their way inside. The door flew open, and within seconds, guns were drawn, voices shouting commands. "Hands up! Don't move!" Derek lunged toward the kitchen, but an officer tackled him before he could reach the back door. He thrashed violently, screaming obscenities, but the officers were stronger. His hands were yanked behind his back, cuffs snapping around his wrists. His face was pressed into the dirty linoleum floor, the fight draining out of him. Melissa didn't resist. She simply sank to her knees, her arms raised in surrender. She had no words, no excuses. As the officers rushed past her, their voices turned to murmurs of horror when they discovered Ava's body. The air grew heavier, suffocating with the weight of what had happened. One officer, his face pale, called for medical personnel, but they all knew it was pointless. There was no saving Ava now. Melissa and Derek were dragged from the apartment past the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered outside. Gasps and murmurs spread through them as they saw the handcuffed couple. Sarah stood among them, her eyes filled with rage and sorrow. She had tried to stop this. She had called for help. But it had come too late. The trial that followed was swift. The autopsy confirmed the unimaginable suffering Ava had endured. The jury listened in silence as the prosecution detailed every injury, every burn, every moment of pain the little girl had suffered before she died. Derek showed no remorse. He smirked in the courtroom, unbothered by the horror he had caused. Melissa, on the other hand, broke down in tears, claiming she had been manipulated, that she hadn't wanted to hurt her daughter. But no one believed her. She had chosen Derek over Ava, and now she would pay the price. Derek was sentenced to life without parole. Melissa received 50 years. Ava was gone, but her story would never be forgotten. Her suffering became a painful reminder of the failures of those who should have protected her. And for Melissa, there was no greater punishment than knowing she had let the one person who truly needed her slip away forever.